Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon for those of you in a different time zone. My name is Martin Rama. I am the chief economist of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm very pleased today to be chairing this seminar, The Impact of COVID-19 in Latin America. Many people have registered for this seminar, so many that we cannot accommodate them all through WebEx. So some of you are connected through WebEx. Some of you are connected through YouTube. Before we go into the seminar, just a reminder for those of you connected through WebEx, please mute when you are not speaking. And for those who are not panelists or participants, if you don't connect your video, you use better your bandwidth. So before we go to the panel itself and to the discussion, let me first turn to the real organizers of this event, Julio Ritort, who is an assistant professor of finance at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Chile, and Sergio Schmuckler, colleague, lead economist in the Development Research Group of the World Bank. Julio, may I turn to you first to introduce this seminar?
Thanks, Martin, and good day, everybody. So in representation of the Business Finance Center at Adolfo Ibáñez University, we welcome everybody to this seminar. First of all, let me thank the World Bank Research and Development Center in Chile for inviting us to jointly organize this meeting. We expect this to be a very good discussion venue to discuss appropriate policy responses to mitigate the growing impact of the coronavirus pandemic. We thank the President of the Chilean Minister of Finance, Ignacio Briones, who will be opening the panel in a few minutes, and of our prominent speakers who accompany us today, many of them as well former ministers from different Latin American countries. As business school, we're part of the business system and the economy of the region, and it is our responsibility to participate in this type of events of analysis and reflection such as this one. Finally, one of our strategic pillars as an institution is to establish ourselves as a benchmark for leading businesses in Latin America, and we want to maintain the capacity to offer real learning and real research to the developing region. The scope of this event, beyond our national borders, undoubtedly contributes to achieving that objective. Thank you, and good morning.
Thank you very much, Julio. Sergio, I turn to you.
Thanks, Martin and Julio. Thanks to all the prominent speakers, Mr. Minister Briones, Laura, Guillermo, Mauricio, Andres, for agreeing to participate and making this event a huge success. Thanks to all the participants for connecting via YouTube and WebEx. As of this morning, we had an unprecedented record of 1,700 registered participants. The materials of this talk will be available and sent out after the seminar, including a video with Spanish subtitles. This event is organized between the World Bank Research and Development Center in Chile and the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. The center was established by the government of Chile and the Development Research Group at the bank with the goal of creating and disseminating knowledge that is important to both Chile and developing countries, especially those in Latin America. We do this in partnership with different government institutions in Chile and different centers of academic excellence in Chile, like this one today. The results of this collaboration are events like this one and smaller workshops, research and development policy brief using cross-country data and unique data from Chile. And in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have already done work on firm financing during the crisis that was presented in this seminar series. I hope to continue collaborating with many other institutions in Chile, and I look forward to the fruitful debate today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And before I turn to our distinguished panel, we are really very honored to have this event open by the Minister of Finance of Chile, Ignacio Briones, and it's really a pleasure for us to have you in this event. I understand that you, Minister, and several members of the cabinet are currently quarantined because of COVID-19, because the cabinet has been exposed to people who were contaminated. So we very much hope that you are doing fine in spite of the quarantine. And thank you again for being with us for these opening remarks. Minister.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good, good. I'm glad I made it because I was in a different place, in a different link.
We are now waiting for Minister Ignacio Briones to be giving the opening speech. Ignacio, are you connected?
Martin, I think he's not connected.
Okay, thank you, Alejandra. So we will, of course, welcome the intervention by Ignacio Briones at any time when he joins. Let me turn to our panel, and we are really very privileged to have such an extraordinary panel today to talk about Latin America. We will go by alphabetic order among our speakers. The rules will be the following. Each speaker will have a maximum of 10 minutes for the initial intervention. And then we will turn into a more conversational phase. I will abuse my privilege as chairperson to ask questions, but we also want to get questions among yourselves. I'm sure that there may be reactions from what each of you says, but also from the audience. For the audience, please use the chat function in your WebEx or use the chat function in YouTube. Our teams are collecting the questions, and so that we can repeat them to the broader audience and turn to participants as needed. But so for the first block, 10 minutes each, I will be introducing the speakers as we go one by one. Our first speaker is Laura Alfaro, who is Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School and who was Minister of Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica, her country, from 2010 to 2012. Laura, the floor is yours.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Laura.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to the organizers and in general to the World Bank research team. I have been using a lot of the material that they have put together for teaching and presentations. I'm impressed about the quality of the work, also considering the conditions and the speed. Let me see if this works. So let me start with the obvious. I'd like to start with reminding everyone that this is a health shock. And again, at this point, this is obvious, but it's not clear to me all the leaders have understood what this means and the implications. We know people are getting sick, people can't go to work, many have died, most likely many more will get sick, and sadly, probably more will die. And this is the origin of the problem. People are not going to work, we still don't have vaccines, we don't have treatments, and that means that the way we can limit some of the spreading of the disease is by physical distancing. I know people like to say social distancing, but what we do need is physical distance. And this is, again, the origin of many of the issues that we're facing. This is why this health shock has become an economic shock. First, this is a supply shock. There's less labor, and we also need to adjust production functions. But also, we are afraid to consume in certain places, in particular when there is a lot of people. We're also afraid because many people have lost their job. So this has become a demand shock as well, and a financial shock because there is less revenue, delay in revenue, in many cases, no revenue with the implications for the health of the financial system. And it is a global shock. I'm having some problems here. Is it me or someone else? What happened here? So it's a global shock that has affected advanced, emerging, and developing countries. And this is perhaps the first time that we have a huge shock of this scope. Perhaps what is frustrating for many emerging markets is that the economic shocks hit even before the health shock in the form of disruption of supply chains, collapse of trade, commodities, prices, tourism, remittances, and capital flows. We know of the collapse of trade and the collapse of commodity prices, and again, the outcome of the supply and demand shock, but also policy. In many cases, we cannot go and visit countries. And I mentioned this because of the implications for a lot of economic activity. We also fear protectionism in medical and also in food. And we have seen some of the contest that has been displayed by some of the advanced countries for medical equipment. And I mentioned tourism because this is a forecast by United Nations that seems to present this collapse in tourism to be similar in terms of size as previous shocks. And I am worried that this might take a little bit longer, and depending on your country, certainly Costa Rica, but also many countries in the Caribbean and others in the region, this is looking like a more permanent change, at least in terms of a couple of years. This is creating some, I apologize for the technical, something doesn't seem to be working well. So am I advancing these slides or?
No, at present it's not advancing.
But am I in charge or someone else?
I think you were in charge of the slides.
All right, you were in charge, but I'll be in charge right now. So you tell me when I move on.
Ignacio Briones, it's already in case.
So next slide. So we know that also there has been a very steep and fast collapse in capital flows, FDI, portfolio equity, and also in remittances, which again disproportionately affect some of the countries in Central America and the Caribbean. Next slide. All of this in a background of extreme high leverage by individuals, by firms and countries. Again, IMF, World Bank putting out these statistics that look at the increase in leverage, in particular by sovereigns, and the different composition. But we also know that this decade of very low interest rate, firms have borrowed, but also many individuals have borrowed. And I know in particular, this is also a concern in the case of Costa Rica. Next slide. And let me just zoom in a little bit more, because many countries are facing this pandemic in a very weak economic position, fiscal position, social, and let me also mention in terms of national security, crime, and so on. But in particular, in the case of Costa Rica, I would say that the government has been very reckless, borderline irresponsible with the management of the fiscal accounts. The fiscal deficit in 2019 was close to 7% of GDP. This is a fiscal deficit achieved at a time when the economy was growing and after a tax reform, and still the pandemic faced us with a deficit of close to 7% of GDP. Next slide. Something also worth mentioning, and this is work that I'm doing with Oscar Becerra and Marcela Slava from Colombia, is that the composition or the structure of the economy in many emerging markets is very different from that of developed countries. And I want to mention this because I think a lot of the policies have been inspired by economic structures that are very different from ours. This just compares Colombia and the US. We have a lot of informal work and a lot of very high contact work. And we have done some simulations. And a lot of this informal work is very susceptible early on in the crisis, but it's also work that very quickly and easily comes back. The one that may last a little bit long, but also takes longer to recuperate or to come back, are the formal jobs. So there may be something to be said to try to protect a formality. Next slide.
3 minutes, Laura.
And we know there has been unprecedented policies, local, state, national, and public. I would like also to say that the private sector has also done a lot in this pandemic. Next slide. In terms of multilaterals, we know that there are all these proposals to try to help, in particular, very poor countries with this standby in terms of payments. Click. But we also need to talk, and maybe we'll do a little bit later, what happens if there's no debt relief by China, which has also been an important partner for many countries, not all in the region, but a couple have received support from China. Next slide. And so this is just a reminder of the different letters that have been used to describe recessions: V, U, W, L, click. Some people also have mentioned it could be like Nike. Next slide. And I do worry that a lot of the policies have been done with an implicit V recovery. This is the IMF. Next slide. This is IMF and World Bank for Central America. Costa Rica apparently is going to grow next year 4.5. Let me remind you, we have not grown 4.5 in 5 years, but apparently we're going to do it last year. And again, I am concerned not only because there are certain activities that are likely not going to come back immediately, tourism being one of that represents 7% of GDP in Costa Rica. Next slide. There's also some work that I'm doing with Esther Falla, Nora, and Fasid from Boston University, where we track the response of, in terms of economic activity, and in many countries it does precede the actual lockdowns. Click. And so Larry Summers in a recent presentation made this remark: you can open the economy all you want, but when you're hiring refrigerator trucks to deliver dead bodies to transport them to morgues, not many people are going to go out of their houses. Blaming the economic collapse on policy rather than the problem is fallacious. Click. Again, this is a health shock. Next slide. And solution to a health shock: testing, treatments, equipment, and vaccines. And until we get that, we need to live with some distancing, either de facto or de jure. Click. I have some work that has linked the performance of the stock market with some of these medical changes. Click. But concerns we all know: delay in the vaccine, treatment. I don't know about you, but I've been living in the world that we're going to get a vaccine in January. If we don't get a vaccine in January, I think many things are going to be different. But we also know that it will be impossible to deliver vaccines to everyone by January. We all believe that people who got the disease are immune, but we still don't know, and there might be long-lasting effects. Next slide. So apart from the medical worst-case scenarios, and in terms of policy, the worst-case scenarios that are related with medical and food, I think we need to spend some time thinking what will stay, what should stay, and what needs investment. And again, we're in a world where the liquidity solvency line is not clear. Again, I think a lot of the policies were inspired by a V recovery that is just not going to happen. And so many things are starting to look more insolvent than illiquid. We need to think when people are going to spend and on what. There's going to be a hysteresis on the online world. There's going to be precautionary savings. But there are some things that we do need to make an effort that they go back normal. One is, for example, education. I don't know your experience with homeschooling. I have to say I'm not a fan of homeschooling. There has to be some online activity, but homeschooling has disproportionately affected women. And there's a lot of work that has suggested and shown that women have been taking the burden of this. But we also don't know what are the implications of kids. We know in the 80s, we lost a generation. And it's most likely we're losing a generation now. We send them to home, and there's very little monitoring of the engagement. I also worry that a lot of these policies have been done very quick. Again, there's many countries that don't have a fiscal space, but there's many that don't have the capacity to spend this amount of money very quickly. And it is a lot of money. And we're seeing concerns in the US that unemployment and benefits are going to wrong places. I have seen in Costa Rica, there's also already that people who don't deserve this money are getting it. Now that we put out the policies, we need to engage in a lot of transparency and accountability. I worry that we're not targeting the most vulnerable. And just to end,
yes,
I want to finish with some bigger thoughts. We apparently every 10 years are using this line, all it takes. But it cannot be that we are using all it takes every 10 years. Maybe I'm old enough now, but I have lived many crises. I lived the 80s crisis, the tequila crisis, the Asian crisis. Brazil has many. I won't mention Argentina. But my daughter is not that old, and she already lived the global financial crisis, the COVID pandemic, and she knows there's going to be global climate change. So if we're going to have this every 10 years, it cannot be all it takes every time. And they're also not transitory. So we need to rethink how we're doing policy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you for that strong punchline, which I think will give us a very good basis for the discussion. We are privileged now that Minister Ignacio Briones is connected. So let me propose that we suspend for a moment the panel and we have his introduction. Minister, we are with you.
Good morning to everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Sorry for being late, but I have some technical problems in my house. I am in my home actually, in a quarantine process. So thank you for the invitation. Let me say hello to the speakers and thank Universidad of Ibáñez, its business school, and the World Bank for this opportunity. And I had the opportunity to hear Laura's presentation, which is very complete. So I will skip some of the points I have prepared because they're in the same line, and I will try to skip to some ideas and general comments. And let me start by the invitation of this seminar, asking the question about the impact of COVID-19 in Latin America. Needless to say, the impact will be in the three main dimensions.
And those who are not speaking, please.
Yeah, here we are. So I was saying that, needless to say, that the impact will be huge in the three main important dimensions. Of course, in economic terms, the impacts are there and will be very important, but also the crisis will have a significant social impact. And I do think that we will face significant political effects, which are at the same time necessary in a loop for addressing the social and economic challenges. So this is a big issue. This is a big issue because everything depends on the political system, and the political system will be, in my opinion, significantly stressed. And so the possibility to respond in the medium long term to the effects of this crisis will be challenged significantly. And let me start by some general things and then to move to some general remarks and questions I have for this seminar. Needless to say, we are facing a very different crisis in the sense that this is a crisis that is affecting our social interactions in all the areas. It is challenging our main attribute as human beings, which is our social propension to interact with others, and this is based on the sanitary problem, or this is because of the sanitary problem, but it's affecting our social interactions with families, friends, labor, consuming, the capacity of working, and so on. And this is why we are facing this very atypical crisis in which we face at the same time the demand shock, the supply shock. And of course, the toolkits for addressing these problems are quite different from previous crises. And we should be very clear about this. we do not know very much which are the best policies to address this crisis. And I think this is a first important idea to have in mind, because when we face a financial, we more or less know which is the toolkit and which are the policies which we address. The same is true in a recession, but here
Marilina, ¿cómo estás?
completely different. And this challenge.
Bien, ¿me escuchas?
Please mute the others. Carlos Mejia, please.
So this challenges the capacity of reaction of all the governments, and this is a significant issue for Latin America. In tandem with that, in tandem with the health shock and the economic effects, coupled with domestic lockdown, and so having a huge impact on in the short-term economic activity, we are facing a plummeting in external demand, basically from the export and international trade challenge, as well as the capital flows, or the capital flows and remittances channel. The collapse of commodity prices is affecting the revenues of all our countries, and not last but not least, all of this is coupled with financial volatility, with financial downtowns, which is having effects in the local currencies and the financial market. So we are facing a severe problem, a severe systemic problem in many areas. And needless to say, this will hit us significantly. And this is, of course, the great crisis since the Great Depression. We know from the different surveys that Latin America will be one of the most impacted regions in the world. Of course, we have uncertainties about the numbers and the projections. The different entities are making today, but we know that we will be severely hit. The IMF, as you know, was predicting a decline in a number of about 5.2% for the region. This is huge, and the number is under review. In tandem with that, in Latin America, we have an important structural problem which has to do with informality in the job market. And when you have a system like this one, we are basically facing an important problem in terms of addressing these communities, addressing these social groups which lacks from social protection. And so this is a major challenge for all the government in how to address these people, how to contact these people, how to provide them with help, with support, with cash transfers, and so on. And it's a challenge as well for the health system, in which we know our infrastructure in Latin America is very unequal and not enough to address the kind of demand we are facing with this COVID-19 pandemic. So this open an additional question related, I insist, with the informality of our job market. 40% of our workers belong to the informal sectors. They depend on their day-to-day income for their survival. And in a crisis like this one, in which you see a short-term drop, significant short-term drop in the revenues, well, you are facing a huge problem, which is coupled as well with the social unrest and income inequality that characterized Latin America and was very evident in the previous year, with several social problems and riots in many countries. So this opened an additional difficulty for the governments in the way to deal with the crisis. Last but not least, and Laura was referring to this, the fiscal space most Latin American countries has is limited. They are highly indebted. They have a huge fiscal deficits, and of course, this reduces the scope for intervention, for good intervention from the government, and certainly this is an important problem and challenge for the different economies of the region. Let me move to the economic arena and try to summarize which are the main challenges and problems we are experiencing and the way the different economies are responding to this crisis, including Chile. What we know is that in response, and here's the major problem, the pandemic may produce a huge increase in poverty rates all across the region. We are talking about more or less 5% point of increase in the poverty rate. This is huge. This is about 30 million people in the region by the end of this year, according to ECLAC. Many Latin American countries are facing the risk of bankruptcies all across the economic entities, but especially regarding the small size industries and companies that represent a significant part of jobs. So this is a major challenge, how to react, how to support these companies or these firms in order to avoid is a significant part of the economic policies. So at this regard, I would say that most part of the interventions of the different governments has to do with the following idea, an idea which faces important degrees of uncertainties about the length of this crisis, but in general terms, what we are facing is a transitory shock, but a very deep transitory shock, which has the possibility to produce a lot of damage in terms of destroying companies, destroying jobs, destroying incomes of the households. So I would say that most part of the economic interventions the different governments has enacted has to do with, on the one hand, to reduce this short-term economic and social impact, but in addition to that, to minimize, to reduce, to significantly reduce the permanent and adverse effects that this shock can have in the long term. Because if this happens, we will face a significant additional cost in the forthcoming months and years. So what the government has done at this regard is to produce or to enact direct transfer to vulnerable households. In Chile, for instance, this is what we have done in the recent weeks with a direct transfer to a household. We recently approved in Congress a 3-month program providing general incomes for the most vulnerable families. And certainly this is something that is open to continue if the pandemic is still there. We have to think, in addition, in employment subventions in order to counteract the effect in the job market. We have to protect jobs through different tools. In Chile, we have a significant unemployment fund that was created in the past through the savings of both the employers and the employees. And this allows us to suspend temporarily the contracts, avoiding that the firms fire their employees, waiting for a moment in which the activity can resume. Of course, here providing liquidity to all the spectrum, households, firms, is a significant part of any economic policy. In Chile, we have done this through tax reliefs in several areas at the personal level, but also at the firm level, and of course through programs of guarantee credit loans using state guarantees that are channeled through the financial system is an important part of the policy in order to provide credit, in order to provide liquidity to the companies, allowing them to survive, most of them, we hope, waiting for the moment in which the economy can resume. For this coordination with the economic authorities, and in our experience, in my personal experience, this has been critical. The close coordination of the Ministry of Finance, the government, the central bank, and the financial regulator has proved to be an essential part of all the measures we have undertaken in the financial and credit sector. Because on the one hand, the central banks are providing a lot of liquidity, we know that, but we know that liquidity is just a necessary condition for credit expansion, because we are seeing levels of risk that we have never seen before. And so trying to be coordinated with this liquidity through the possibility of having state guarantees for the financial sector in order to increase the credit, it has been critical. And in tandem with that, we have been in the necessity of reducing, lowering a list of regulations that belong to the financial regulator. And so all of these, the three pieces, central bank, government, and the financial authority, are part of the same will. They should act in a very coordinated fashion, and this has been critical for acting very quickly in the case of Chile. So I think this is a general comment for the region. The capacity to act in the financial market, to act, to provide liquidity, requires as a necessary condition tons of coordination between the different economic activities. So let me finish with some thoughts, some general thoughts that I think are more questions than answers, but I do believe that can be useful for the seminar. So first of all, there is no doubt, I would say, that the social economic effects in the region will be extremely challenging, extremely severe, extremely important in the months to come. The pandemic is touching every aspect of people's lives, and it will continue to touch different aspects of our lives. And this includes not only the dimensions related with material conditions like jobs, incomes, and housing, but also other aspects such as, of course, health, mental health, but also knowledge and skills. In addition, the macroeconomic effects of the crisis are substantial, as I already mentioned. The capital outflows from the region as of today is larger than the one we saw in the subprime crisis. The decline in commodity price for Latin American economies will be severe and will have an important impact, thus deteriorating furthermore our fiscal balances, and the fiscal balance will be a critical piece for recovery. So this opens a very important question on the capacity our economies will face for the recovery phase, based on the budgetary position they are actually facing. So as a result, and this is a point that Laura was enacting, in the aftermath will find us with a significant increase in public deficits and debt, and this is something that we should address. The idea here to have like medium long-term fiscal plans. I think it will be necessary in many countries in order to provide an envelope, a credible envelope that allows the country to get money, to get financing, and to provide a credible commitment for investors that the macroeconomic situation, the deterioration in the macroeconomic situation is just transitory, but they are able to provide a long-term commitment to a more normal situation. So finally, I would like to mention two ideas that are interconnected. The first one is, even if actually all our efforts are concentrated in the crisis, in the pandemic, and the short-term economic and social impacts, I think it's pretty important and necessary to begin to think in the recovery moment, to try to work and to begin to provide ideas and policies thinking in this moment. It's true, the worst part of the sanitary and lockdown effect are to come in the forthcoming months in all our countries, but in the aftermath we will require this significant recovery plan coupled with strong social policies. This should include, of course, sorry, my screen was over. This should include, of course, aggressive public policies in order to foster public and private investment, and I think we should be very innovative in the ways we will address this, because the starting point will be a completely different equilibrium, a completely different scenario compared to what we face in crisis. And so this will require heterodox measures, let me put in this way. So aggressive public policy in order to foster public and private investment, also subventions and social policies. And I think this element should be a priority for all our countries. And we need to think very seriously about this, and especially to work not only in terms of defining the precise or specific public policies, but in order to think in how to reach political agreements in order to set this as the main public policy priority. There are two different things. One is to have a good design of the public policies, and we should think about this starting from now. But I think the most challenging challenging issue here is how to begin to get a discussion preparing the political spectrum and the political actors to be able to get a consensus about this priority. So, in other words, the aftermath, in my opinion, will require tons of political agreement to reach national plans at this regard, and this is something that is not obvious, particularly taking into account the recent political history of our region. And last but not least, in the same line, although this is a transitory shock, of course, with a lot of uncertainties about its length, I do believe that it's important to recognize that this crisis will have several permanent effects. Of course, as Laura was mentioned, some industries will be completely modified. Transportation, leisure, industry, tourism, even the business space and offices are some examples of this. Some others will prevail, some other industry will prevail, but will face an important drop in their demand in the forthcoming months. And so they will face a liquidity problem, yes, but it's a liquidity problem that has more the flavor of solvency problem, at least for a significant part of the main actors of a given industry. And this is something that poses a significant challenge. This, I think, is very important in terms of thinking in how to reconvert industries and jobs in the aftermath. And this is something we have to think about. In a sense, and this is something I do believe it should be noticed, the COVID-19 as an exogenous coordination mechanism, moving us from a former steady state equilibrium to a new one in many areas. And in many areas, this involves opportunities. For instance, the possibility to have improved organization schemes with lower transaction costs, and so allowing to have or to be able to have permanent productivity gains in the forthcoming years. So we have like a gain in terms of present value, because we will have a new forms of organization with lower transaction costs, as what we are doing actually in this seminar. But aside from this gain, I think the cornerstone here is to realize that in this change and through this process, there will be significant winners but significant losers. And this, of course, raises the critical question about the political economy in dealing with this transition, the point I already referred to. I think this is the major challenge. So aside from health and economic policies in terms of their precise design, in my opinion, the political economy and the threats that our democracies will face in the aftermath of this crisis will be probably the major challenge we will face in the forthcoming years, because based on this political economy, based on the capacity, the response capacity of our democracy, all the social, economic reconversion and the different policies we should carry on depend on this, and this is why this is something we should address, we should discuss, and we hope, and I hope, we will be able to reach agreements in several areas in order to address these issues. So these were initial remarks, my main comments, and thank you for this seminar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Briones, for such a comprehensive introduction. I think you set the stage very well with the starting with the social unrest that we have seen in the region and ending with the need for the agreements and the political economy, but touching along the way on informality, financial sector, the need to protect the fiscal space, a call for some heterodoxy. I think this sets the stage very well. We understand that you may need to leave at some point, but if you want to stay with us and participate in the discussion, that will be, of course, extraordinary. Thank you very much. Let me turn to now to Guillermo Calvo to continue with our panel. Probably Guillermo doesn't need much introduction in Latin American settings. Guillermo is a professor of economics at Columbia University. He was the chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank in the early 2000s. He was president of the International Economic Association. And he's making his maiden trip to WebEx on this event. And as we have his slides here in front of us. Guillermo, delighted to have you with us. 10 minutes. I will be reminding you 3 minutes before they expire. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to this panel. What I'm going to do, in contrast with the thorough presentations that we have heard, is to focus on the short run. I focus on the short run because we don't have a short run, we don't have a long run either. Now, I'm very concerned about the short run, so let me just say what motivates these comments. I'm very concerned that we may miss the fact that even though we are really facing a very challenging future because we know very little about it, it's a short run that we have to take care very carefully because we can impair the possibility of a reasonable, satisfactory medium term. And my focus is on problems that may arise in the payment system. So that's why I'm saying this is short run. And that's why the title of my presentation, and in particular, one element in all of this that has been mentioned, of course, is the flight to quality. Because we live in a situation now where the two parts of the world, so to say, the advanced markets and the emerging markets are different. While here, you have a machine for printing dollars. That doesn't happen in the South. So certain solutions, big expenditure that we are seeing now here, that's not in principle in the short run, take at the cost of some areas. You do not need to redistribute. You need to have, you can have a larger fiscal deficit, but you have fiscal space, not because of the treasury, but the fiscal space because you have the central bank. If you try to do the same thing in the South, you may run into trouble. And as I point out there, and everybody knows about it, of course, they tend to face higher interest rates, whereas here is the opposite. And they may have to resort to the inflation tax. And one reason why that's true is that, or that's relevant at least, is that as we have seen in this country, in the US, the central bank has been the main actor. So that it's very likely that in emerging markets, the central banks will have to take the lead with a initial situation, which is quite different. Now, here is just the only picture I'm going to show. And it's based on some study. Please go back to the previous one. Thank you. It's based on some research that I've done with Ernesto Tarvi and Izquierdo some time ago. And one thing that studying Southern Stop is that you have two curves there. The full curve is the GDP during a crisis. So you see that at time T, it collapses. But simultaneously, the other one, the dash curve, is inflation. So, of course, for the sample that we had, which by the way was very comprehensive sample, still inflation was the fashion at the time. So they started at 30%, but still went up to double that. And number one. And number two, the other convex curve, the other curve that we have to keep in mind for economies like this, aside from the one having to do with the health, is inflation. So you see that in this crisis, inflation, of course, in the whole episode, inflation rises quite a bit. But at the beginning, you have some sort of convexity there. So inflation, as we know, starts going slowly and all of a sudden jumps up. So we have to be careful because we are going through this period where inflation is not a big issue. But that can change. So let me move. Oops. I don't know what happened to my view.
We can hear you, and we see your slides.
I can see it too. Now, so let's go back to the previous slide, please. Can you go to the previous one? Oh, no, that's okay. So next one. Okay, great. So the other thing that has already been mentioned is that what this crisis is doing is forcing us to do something fiscal right there. So there is a transfer to large, small and medium enterprises, a transfer to the informal sector. So how do you finance that? That's not easy. And even if we are going to get, if these countries are going to get support from advanced economies, that takes time. So the question is what to do now. You see, that's why I keep insisting on the short run. How you do it, be careful how you do it, because maybe you will get help later on. But if you don't manage it right, when the help comes, you may have an economy which is much more destroyed, so to say, less workable, if you didn't manage this well. So the two things that we have been discussing is the first one, reprofiling international debt. That is the hot discussion in Argentina at this point. So that's one thing, but that takes time. I'm afraid that the main tool that these countries have in the short run is money, QE, some sort of QE. So, and inflation has been useful. If you have to do these transfers, an advantage of inflation is that it can reduce the real value of government expenditure. And you can use that bonus, so to say, to transfer to where you wanted the money to go to in the short run. So that has to be very well understood. You do that in the short run, of course, there are going to be forces that will be very hard for the governments to withstand. It may very well topple the government. So it's very important that what you're doing in the short run like that, an inflation spurt, which we saw in the sample I just showed, that inflation does not produce serious political imbalances, number one. Number two, although inflation in the short run could be good, and it has been good in previous crises, because none of those episodes that we look ended up in hyperinflation. Actually, as everybody knows, and studies in the World Bank in particular have shown that rather the regions, the emerging markets, have been exhibiting low inflation, surprisingly low inflation. So those crises did not give rise to very high inflation. However, the memory that people have in the region of very high inflation may make policymakers much more hesitant to go that way, number one. And number two, the lesson is that that could be a good, very short-run instrument, but it has to be accompanied by a very disciplined monetary policy as soon as these needs disappear or get ameliorated, or the help from the rest of the world comes. So it's transitional. If you don't deal with this carefully, then you have a list of problems there in my slide. The quasi-monies in Argentina, this issue is already being discussed, the famous patacones, because the provincial authorities they have no way to pay. So it's as simple as that. And they are authorities, so they have a monopoly power to some extent, so that can create the incentives are there. But we know what the solution, what happens after that. Financial repression, something that Cameron Reichert has been reminded us lately. And again, if you want to look at financial repression, just go to Argentina now, where the market, 3 minutes, yes, where the market exchange rate doubles the official exchange rate. So you know what happens with that. That's not help. That doesn't help the payment system. And then the third one, which again Argentina has tried, and even Brazil in the 80s, is paying interest on money. Because you are desperate, you want to use your money to help the informal sector, but at the same time you're worried about inflation. So in some way or another, you start compensated money holders in different ways. You pay interest through the banking system. I cannot enter into details, and that is the mechanism for hyperinflation. And if you want to see even a beautiful explosion of that sort, just there are papers in the JPE on Hungary in 1946. but I cannot enter into that. So I'm very, if that happens, then all of a sudden, it's not just the flow, international flows become difficult to implement. Even if you have good relations with the rest of the world, and then you say, well, now funds can come our way. No, not necessarily, because if you don't have a healthy banking system or payment system, you don't have a way to make the transfer. Small things like that we usually in macro, we don't think much about it, can interfere very seriously. So let me just, I have the last one. If you can switch to, great. This is just a warning. It's a warning because when I was talking about this with my friends, and I said, gee, this is capital outflow. They said, no, but be careful because that seems to be changing. There was a big capital outflow at the very beginning, right, March, April, right? But then Peru could issue a bond in good terms, and Mexico too. I think it issued the largest bond in years, and so on, at relatively low interest rate. So that made me go back to our studies on this. Actually, what you see, and it is typical of this situation, that's why I emphasizing it here, is that while the whole system has a sudden stop, the sectors, public and private sector, are hit differently. The private sector can hit very badly, like it did in the US. While, remember 2008-9, it was an expansion of fiscal deficit. So in the US, and nobody would be surprised about that. But if you take a sample of Latin American countries, the LAC countries, you will see that while there was a big contraction in credit in the private sector, the public sector suffered much less. So let's be. That's why I warn, because don't take that as an indication that things are going to be rosy all the way forward. Part of the reason is very natural, and of course I'm very glad that I'm discussing these issues in the context of the World Bank, because the sovereigns themselves, they have some sources which are not available to the private sector, only indirectly. If the foreigners get support from the World Bank, the IMF, etc., that sort of thing that we see in it working now. So I'm not terribly surprised that some countries all of a sudden, in the midst of this pandemonium of a pandemic, in the midst of a pandemonium, they can issue bonds long term because they see that there is goodwill on the part of advanced countries to help. So that could be a collateral, right? So that's why a warning. Let's not take it, let's not be complacent about it, because this may not be a good forecast of the challenges that we are seeing in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo, for such a sobering assessment of the short-term situation and its risks. So that we have enough time for questions at the end, let me quickly turn to our third speaker in the panel, Mauricio Cárdenas, who is a senior research scholar at Columbia University, was Minister of Finance in Colombia, Minister of Mines and Energy. Mauricio, very happy to have you with us. 10 minutes. I will send you a reminder when there are 3 minutes left. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you. Glad to see you, Martin, and thank you for the invitation. Glad to be in this very select group of co-panelists. I hope everyone is okay. I hope everyone is taking care. And I know there's a big audience listening to this, so hello to them as well. You've seen the recent numbers in terms of the evolution of the pandemic. It's heading south with a vengeance. It's very strong in the number of countries in Latin America with an increasing number of cases is growing. There are only few cases where the pandemic seems to be controlled. Ecuador, Jamaica, Paraguay with very few cases, but for the rest, this is growing. We are economists. We are not epidemiologists. And I think we should listen to that profession. And what they're saying is that this is not controlled. They have a very difficult task, even us as economists, because they have to model social interactions, human behavior, which is not always easy in this context. And I guess we just have to be humble and listen to them. And what they're saying is, this is not controlled yet. Therefore, countries that went into quarantines and severe lockdowns may not go to normal very soon. At the same time, in our countries, it's very hard to sustain long lockdowns. We just don't have the means to do that. Because of a number of issues, including informality that was mentioned by the minister and was mentioned by Laura, this is not probably going to be easy. So we're going to live in a gray area where we'll have some isolation, we'll have some social distancing, things will become a bit more normal as time goes. But that normal area, or that gray area, means that at the same time, governments will have the pressure to support people that will stay at home, support businesses that are going to be basically running at speed. And at the same time, consumers are going to be very hesitant because there's a lot of uncertainty about the future. So, demand will need some type of support to get things back on track. So I think this is a tremendous challenge for governments. So my remarks, I'd like to focus on two issues. One is, given this framework where we'll be in this gray area with a lot of pressures on governments, what will happen to economic growth and what will happen to the fiscal balances? And I think these are two critical issues for policymakers in the region at this point. Let me begin with the fiscal issues. So there are three questions here. The additional fiscal stimulus that has been adopted in many countries, will it be a temporary expansion in fiscal deficits, or will be more permanent? Two, is this enough, what we've done so far? And three, how are we going to finance this? And later on, how are we going to pay for this? So let me begin with the enough part. I think we're just at the very beginning. We're probably in the second inning if we were in a baseball game. There'll be more pressures on government expenditures. There'll be less tax revenues relative to what was expected, even with the revised figures. So governments have to be aware that they need more bullets, because this is going to last for a while. This gray area is going to be very demanding in terms of government support on a number of fronts. At the same time, some of the expenditures that have been approved, let me broadly call them, as they call them in the streets in Brazil, the Corona vouchers. The Corona vouchers are, these cash transfers to segments of the population that are essentially vulnerable. They come at a time in a region when there's a lot of social unrest. I don't really think it's going to be that easy to take those subsidies away very fast, because there'll be a lot of pressure to keep them. At the same time, there's some of the expenditures that are being approved now that will have long-lasting consequences. For example, the credit guarantees that governments are offering. We don't know what's going to happen with the quality of debt, and eventually some of those guarantees will will materialize, and governments will have to pay that. So I think we should be realistic and say that these large deficits are going to probably last longer than what we think now, and that will have consequences. Let's talk a bit about the financing of this. So, and I'll come to a point that was mentioned by Guillermo at the very end. Deficits will increase, but there are limits. We don't live in a region where we can afford the whatever it takes solution. We can do whatever we can, And there are a number of ceilings and restrictions that we have. Some of them are related to credit ratings. Some countries really have the fear of losing an investment grade because of the consequences of that. So that could be one of the constraints. But also, some countries were lucky to have some savings to pay for these additional deficits. That's Peru, Chile, to some extent Colombia, with the savings from the oil royalties of the past. But we're running out of those savings. We have mobilized domestic resources to the extent possible, but additional fiscal deficit will probably rely on more external financing, which means that that we'll need to ensure that we have access to external financing. Guillermo is right in saying that there is perhaps an excessive optimism about the capacity of markets to provide that financing. Yes, there's been a number of transactions that were successful in the past, say, couple of months: Mexico, Peru, Panama, Paraguay, Guatemala. They managed to issue bonds. But my sense is that we have to be very cautious about the role of markets. Why? Because there are a lot of uncertainties in the global economy. As uncertainties grow in the global economy, there will be more flight to quality. Investors will prefer more safe assets. Also, the numbers in our region are going to come out very negative. That, of course, affects sentiments on the part of investors as well. So I don't think we should rely too much on this idea that the markets are going to be there to finance. Maybe we should hope for that, but we should plan for something else because it may not happen. So that brings us to the issue of the multilateral development banks. And as everyone knows, I worked very hard a couple of years ago on making sure that the World Bank got additional capital. I'm glad we did that, but that's not enough. The MDBs are very constrained in terms of capital. They'll have limitations, especially going into 2021. So we'll need to figure out ways in which we can build a bridge between the global liquidity, essentially generated by the central banks that issue reserve currencies, and the needs of our region. We have to build that bridge. The markets played that role to some extent during the last decade. But if we're a bit hesitant and pessimistic about the idea of markets doing that again, we need of something else. So the first best solution will be to provide more capital to the MDBs. But we all know that that's a very complex process because it requires legislative action in countries like the US. It also brings a number of governance issues like voting rights. So it's very hard. So I think what I'm proposing is a solution that relies more on central banks, less on the executive branch of government, more on the central banks. The central banks of the advanced economies, they have the mandate. They should be worried about the global economy. They have the capacity to provide some of that liquidity, the QE, to transfer that liquidity into emerging economies through different mechanisms. One idea is an SPV formed with the MDBs. That's something I wrote last week. We don't know if they have the political willingness to do that. And I think that's the crucial issue here. But that's something in which we all should work, especially coming from the emerging economies. Put more pressure on them. And I'll finish with that, the last 2 minutes. We all know that there's a discussion about the short-term effects, whether how fast the recovery is going to be. But the question here is what's going to be the long-term impact on potential output growth. And I see COVID-19 as a catalyzer that has accelerated some reactions that were already there for reshoring, deglobalization, protectionism. Now added to that, lack of travel, even human behavior that will basically change, and then people are going to be less inclined to do tourism. A number of things that are going to be affected by COVID that will just accelerate this process that will have a negative effect on our economies in terms of long-term growth. So we need to start thinking about how to offset that. And of course, the number of sectors that can grow in a more digital way, like health, education, finance. So we need to start thinking about those additions to potential growth in our region that could offset the negative effects associated with deglobalization. So we need to make sure that in the recovery packages, we start thinking about those sectors and those investments that will be needed in order to ensure that potential output growth is not affected badly. And that's essentially my last point. So we have to be very smart in terms of the allocation of the budget. There are lots of pressures today. One good starting point for all countries in the region is to start planning for a budget in 2021 with base zero. There are a number of things that we were doing in the past that are probably not going to be necessary in the future or less important. We need to make sure that we open some fiscal space and to be part of the conversation. And then sure that we think, where is the highest payoff per dollar or per peso invested in our budgets? Because there will be a lot of needs for the recovery, and there will be a lot of needs to make sure that potential growth is not affected as we come out of these crises. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mauricio, for sticking to your time. Last panelist, and we have 15 minutes of the official time left. So, and I would like to have a bit of time for questions and answers. Last panelist is Andres Velasco, who is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, who was Finance Minister of Chile from 2006 to 2010. Andres, floor is yours. I will send you a reminder 3 minutes before the time.
Thank you very much, Martin. Delighted to be part of this panel with the Minister, Laura, Guillermo, and Mauricio, all great economists and dear friends. I have a 10-year-old son who likes to watch late-night shows in the US in which they ape President Trump, who always says that things are huge. Actually, in a Brooklyn accent, he says huge. Well, this is huge. This is a very large, very substantial crisis, which is also unlike anything else we have ever seen. This is a panel of Latin American economists, so we all have PhDs in balance of payments crisis, banking crisis, currency crisis, debt crisis. But we have never confronted a situation in which the government and the health authorities told workers, please don't work, and in which they told people who run enterprises, please close them and go home. So I think the first thing that we have to admit is that we're all on very uncharted terrain here. Even the governments that are doing things best are making up policies as we go. So the range of uncertainty is gigantic, and I think the willingness to experiment and to learn along the way must be very, very substantial as well. Because this is all so varied and so complex, let me just focus on one macroeconomic fact. I will leave the dynamics of contagion to the people who know more about that. And let me just focus on macro, let me focus on employment, and let me focus on what one can plausibly say about the speed of recovery. And parenthetically, let me engage in a bit of advertising here. Some of my remarks are based on a paper with Luis Felipe Céspedes, who used to be a professor at Adolfo Ibáñez, and Roberto Chang, which is hot off the press. It came out just yesterday at both the NBER in Cambridge and the CEPR in London. The key thing that firms have is entrepreneurial capital. And that is a combination of know-how and the right workers. If, as a result of liquidity constraints, firms go belly up, firms close, or firms have to shed a lot of labor, there's one thing we know: the recovery is going to be very, very slow. Because today we cannot go out and buy things, so demand is artificially suppressed. When in a month's time or 2 months' time or 6 months' time, we're allowed to go out and we demand things, well, if because of liquidity constraints, because of inability to pay bills, pay workers, pay debts, many of the firms went under, supply will be constrained, productivity will be down. If firms have had to shed key workers, they will be less productive, they will be less good at what they do. And then we can be sure that, in fact, the recovery will be slow. One way of making this point is to disagree slightly with my friend and colleague Laura Alfaro. Laura was saying, well, the recovery is going to be very slow. And that may be true, but I think it helps to realize that the speed of recovery has an exogenous and an endogenous element. The exogenous element, or at least exogenous to the economics, not entirely exogenous to government, is of course whether a vaccine comes, whether contagion is very fast. Of course, if Oxford or someone decides that they found the vaccine, the conversation will be very, very different. But there's also an endogenous element. Economic policy provides incentives for people to stay home or to go to work. But most fundamentally, and this is what I want to focus on, economic policy provides the means by which firms may have the liquidity, keep paying workers, they maybe will remain constant on their loans, and therefore they will be ready to produce when we go back to some semblance of normality, or maybe that will not happen. So the policy response today in the very short run, as Guillermo was emphasizing, will determine crucially what happens 6 months from now. And it is in this sense that even though we don't know how long this will last, and it could last very long, and if I had to put my money on it, I think it will be painful and deep and persistent and nasty. But the extent of that persistence and the extent of that nastiness is very much going to be determined on whether governments do bold things. So it is in this very limited but very precise sense that we have to be bold, that we have to be audacious, that we have to do whatever it takes. The big difference, of course, between rich countries and poor countries is that rich countries, advanced countries, issue reserve currencies, and they can afford to do whatever it takes. First of all, because they're not rationed out of debt markets, and secondly, because they issue currencies that people are willing to hold in an emergency. We Latin Americans, most emerging market economies, do not have that luxury for the reasons that Guillermo has been writing about for many years and which he explained very clearly just a minute ago. So the list of things governments can be doing, ought to be doing, and in some cases are doing is long. They could be paying wages, either directly or indirectly, to keep that employment relationship from collapsing. And the UK, where I am right now, is doing that. So is Holland, so is Denmark, and so is indirectly the Republic of Chile. The minister, of course, has been spearheading this effort. We can provide subsidized credit or direct lines of credit by the central bank. The key, of course, is that you can take the horse to the water, but you cannot make the horse drink, which is a poetic way of saying that it's not enough to have the credit. Government and central bank and regulators must ensure that the credit reaches the actual firms. In some cases, equity injections may be called for, and equity injections help because they give control. So you make sure that, in fact, the money is used to pay workers and to settle debts and to keep investing and not to fuel capital flight. And maybe debt guarantees have a role to play, not on their own, but when coupled with other policies. Now, all these wonderful policies that Peru, Chile, and the UK, and many other countries, Colombia to some extent, have been putting into place, run against two constraints. The first one is a fiscal constraint, and the other one is a current account constraint. And we should keep
3 minutes.
I'm on my way, Martin. Thank you. 3 minutes will be plenty. Clearly, the first and obvious question is, do we have fiscal space? And I completely agree with Guillermo's assessment that we should not infer from the fact that we have market access today that we will continue to have access tomorrow or next year. We know that the ability to roll over debt is exactly the first thing that vanishes in the event of a financial crisis. So it is wonderful that Mexico and Colombia and Chile and Peru today have access to capital markets. We cannot be sure that will be the case next year. The second issue, of course, is that if we're asking the public sector to run a deficit, and if we're asking firms to keep paying workers while they have no revenue, well, firms are also running a deficit. Therefore, unless private households are big savers, and maybe temporarily they are, but not on a permanent basis, the government is going to be running a current account deficit. So ultimately, the very big policy question for emerging markets in general, and for Latin America in particular, is how do we pay for that current account deficit? A few countries may have reserves, and the reserves may help smooth the transition. And here Guillermo has written quite a lot in the past, and very insightfully so, about the need to use reserves. You know, we don't accumulate reserves simply to keep them there in a shelf. We need to use them, and we need to have rules that are not destabilizing for injecting those reserves. But most countries don't have sufficient reserves. So the question of access from the IFIs, from the IMF, from the World Bank becomes crucial. Mauricio said this, and I just want to emphasize it. Even for well-behaved countries, which are middle-income countries with reasonable policies, and some of those happen to be in Latin America, some in Southern Africa, some in East Asia, having access to financing from the IFIs is going to turn out to be absolutely crucial. The World Bank, the IDB, the regional development banks have plenty of very good advice. They have some money, but in the big scheme of things, the money they have is not very much. The the IMF has lending capacity of about $1 trillion by the fund's own recognition, but Kristalina Georgieva, the new IMF managing director, said in a statement at the IMF World Bank meetings a few weeks ago that the fund estimates the overall financing needs of emerging markets in 2.5 billion. So the IMF is in a position to fund only 40% of what emerging markets need. So we need to be creative. And let me just end by saying that in my book, the most creative and most plausible alternative is the one that Mauricio proposed in a Project Syndicate piece last week. I've been peddling it around to anybody who will listen. And let me just describe it in this way, Martin and I will end. There's a lot of liquidity being created by the major central banks of the world, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan. There are takers for that hard currency liquidity in the emerging market world. The question is, who plays intermediary? One alternative would be for the IMF to issue bonds that the Fed could buy and the IMF could in turn lend. That may run into difficulties that are partially political and partially legal. So why not set up a special purpose vehicle which could be run by the fund, or by the fund and the bank and the multilateral agencies and banks together, whose main purpose is basically to play an intermediary role and take that liquidity to the countries that need it. There are wrinkles in that scheme that need to be ironed out, but something like that is going to be absolutely key. Otherwise, I am afraid that 6 months from now, we will be looking at a situation across the developing world and across emerging markets of massive job losses, of sharply contracting economic activity, potentially magnified by the kind of financial second and third round effects that we have seen so many times in Latin America. And that is not only bad for emerging markets, that is also bad for the citizens of rich countries. Because today, emerging markets, if you look at PPP calculations, are 59% of world GDP. And therefore, if we crash, the world crashes, and that will be bad for rich country citizens as well. So there's a big efficiency case to be made for collaboration. What I think we need now is political leadership. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres, for this perfectly timed closing of the panel segment. We are almost at the time, and we know that several of you may have other commitments. We know also that many in our audience may have time to stop at 1:30, but we can stay connected for a bit more. So while thanking you for those of you who will disconnect, thanking you very much for this very thoughtful panel discussion. For those who are willing to stay a few extra minutes and keep this conversation, as Andres said, among friends and really a distinguished group of economists from the region who have been both on the policy side and on the analytical side, let me just pose 3 questions, and each of you can jump in different ways about it. One of the questions is about this gray area that Mauricio was referring to. We have a lot of uncertainty. Andres said 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, but the question that I'm receiving questions from journalists, from panelists is, about the final slide that Laura had. Is V, is this W, is this L? And depending on what we see as the main reason for the delay in the recovery, also how we will use the resources matters a lot. So my first question to any of you is, who wants to jump, is what will be the main reason for not having the V? Will it be that the rich economies will not recover? Will it be that we will lose entrepreneurial capacity? Will it be that we don't have the means for demand policy, demand support because of fiscal constraints when demand will be collapsing? Because that will be very important to determine how we use our scarce resources in the meantime. Second question related to that. I think Guillermo was very clear on the need for extraordinary measures. They came out in different ways, how to avoid a situation where extraordinary measures are like the patacones of Argentina at some point and things get much worse. But we see things like active forbearance, protecting jobs as opposed to just protecting workers, because that's what will allow us to have a strong recovery. We have a lot of the questions, I might tell you, that we are receiving from the audience are about protecting people, protecting the informal sector workers. We all agree that there is a constrained space. What is the priority? The payment systems, the entrepreneurial capacity that we have accumulated, those who are most in need. I think the question is very clear that we cannot do whatever it takes. We can only do whatever we can, as Mauricio said. So what is it that we do as a priority? And last question, and not least, is very clear a consensus among all of you that is international finance, and international finance probably going through some supranational arrangement and national governments and channel to the private sector in one way or another, that a lot of that may not happen for political reasons, voting rights and other things. What role can economies play in creating the momentum for a solution like this? So 3 questions. Any of you who wants to jump in, try to be brief because we will be starting losing audience as we go on. We are already a bit over the time. Who wants to come in first?
Well, you can hear me?
Yes, Guillermo, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Now, just a small comment because I was inspired by the comments of Mauricio and Andres, having to do about the role of the World Bank in particular, because that's one of the things that it will be really very useful now, and probably it will become strictly necessary going a little bit forward because of the lack of finance. I would like to add just one comment to what Andres in particular has mentioned about the having the World Bank play an active role in dispersing the funds that could be gotten from the capital market. I think if you're going to do something like that, if the bank is going to start sort of managing and sort of giving a backup in a certain sense for the debt of emerging markets, it may be necessary to also have some say on what emerging markets do with their debt. Otherwise, we know, I mean, there's a moral hazard or a political hazard, I don't know what name to give it. But if you want to create an institution that does not destroy itself in a year's time, when people start, or countries start not honoring their obligations for whatever reason, a good idea could be flat on the ground. And so I think it's very important to make sure that, let me say one thing which needs a lot of discussion, but I've been talking since the 90s about the creation of an emerging market fund. where these obligations will be part of the package. But if they are part of the package, that institution should also have some say on debt policy, the debt structure, etc., etc. That may be complicated, but if you don't do that, again, it can self-destroy very quickly, and also the countries that will be on the other side of the table may have a lot of hesitation to really make a big effort. A small one you can always get, but a big one, which is what we might need. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo. Very clear suggestion on how to combine a fund with a discipline of that institutions, some multilateral institutions can bring into the table. Anyone else who wants to react?
Can I
Sure,
react?
Please, Laura.
So your deeper question is why this is not a V. It is not a V because the virus is still among us. And independently of the demand and financial issues, at the very least, production has to run, if you want to think about it, 1/3 because of the fiscal distancing. So that already has implications in terms of output. Again, not considering the other implications in terms of demand and financial. And let me just go back to Andres' comment. I do agree that firms have some form of entrepreneurial capital, know-how, and the right workers, but it differs. It differs between formal and informal firms. It differs between large, medium, small. It differs between established, not established. Not all have the same to, if you want, merit or create an externality worth subsidizing. And the longer we go in this, it depreciates. It's not given. Even a dentist, which we all hope we will go back to the dentist after this. If this goes 2 years, the machine is not going to work, at the very least. The tour guide, it's not clear to me we need to save the tour guide. It is not clear to me we need to be saving all these offices that were being used for a lot of public activities that are just not going to happen. So not all should be saved. And we also need to create new ones. So that is my view, that saving every job and saving over every firm is not correct, because even before there were things that we needed to shut down, and now we need to invest in new things. And that is why, on top of the fact that we just don't have the money that rich countries have, we do need to focus on the vulnerable. I do think we need to keep formal activity, and we need to allocate funds there. But beyond that, saving every job and saving every firm, I just don't think we have the fiscal space or the capacity to do it.
Thank you, Laura. Very good point. Before I turn to the next one, and I see Andres raising a finger, but I would like to also give a chance to the others. We can continue this, but just a couple of points. I think linking to what Minister Briones said about the social unrest and the discontent. Who makes those choices? I think Laura and Andres is not just what are the right choices, but how they are made. Could be very important as to what is saved and what not. I think we all understand that without a vaccine, the epidemic will be with us for a long time. But it has been true for all epidemics except for smallpox, that it was a social ending that happened before an epidemiological ending happened. So we'll need to handle that. Mauricio, you may want to say something. You were mentioned here.
Sure. Well, let me jump in now. It's very hard to predict how the recovery is going to be, but all the factors that you mentioned, what happens in the advanced economies is crucial. What happens to financial markets? But at the end of the day, it's about health. Because entering this gray area, we're going to be in a car where we're going to have the brake and the accelerator, at the same time. And that's just going to speed up or slow things depending on what happens with the pandemic. By the way, governments are going to be more inclined to respond to the health factors, because that's what the population is now caring about the most, making sure that the number of cases does not explode, and certainly not the number of deaths. So being in that car, you're exposed to very different speeds, and that's going to be reflected in what happens with the economy. Let me say that the longer it takes to be in that gray area, the more pressures the governments will have, because the governments will have, to support people in very difficult circumstances, people that go to work, people that stay at home, businesses that are operating, businesses that are not operating. So it's going to be a lot of pressure. So here the big question, if I were to nail down this to a specific question, is what's the limit? If we cannot do everything it takes, what is it that we can? And I agree with Guillermo that if we circumvent markets and we go through the IFIs or MDBs, there's going to be a tension of doing more than what we can pay in the long term. And therefore, there has to be some monitoring here. And that's what I think the IMF plays a very important role. Now, this does not mean that markets are completely left out. Yes, we can still access markets, but markets need to de-risk. This special purpose vehicle would also play the role of reducing the risk, say introducing some credit enhancements to these loans that are being provided to emerging economies so that the markets develop an appetite again. So it's about de-risking as well. So my point is, we need this bridge. The IMF and the MDBs are in a unique position to promote that bridge because they need it. And that's what will give them, more capacity to lend to these countries and more influence on their policy making.
Thank you, Mauricio. I think Andres had 1 or 2 hands. So Andres.
Thanks very much. Well, Laura was saying she's looking forward to going back to the dentist. I want to begin by asserting that I am not looking forward to going back to the dentist. One thing that I am enjoying of the current situation. 2 very quick comments. Yes, it is true that the virus is keeping the economy slow or paralyzed today. The question in my mind is, once the virus begins to recede, either because containment is so effective or because the vaccine has been found, will the economy be in any shape to spring back, or will it be inert? And it is in that domain that policy has a big role to play. Yes, there are travel agents and bus companies and transport companies and hotels that probably will not make it. But the truth of the matter is, we have no idea what the extent of structural change is going to be. At this point, we can all speculate on whether office buildings will be empty, whether we will go back to work or not. It's fun to speculate, but we have no idea. So my suggestion would be, let's have that discussion 6 months from now, a year from now. And in the time being, let us endeavor to provide enough financing so that most firms make it at least to the first half of the year. Second point is that Laura's absolutely right. Firms are unlike each other. And clearly, the organizational capital of a very sophisticated firm is very different from that of an informal kiosco that sells candy on a street corner. But here, paradoxically, we may be lucky because the ability of government to provide support, credit, guarantees, and all kinds of things is going to be limited largely to formal or semi-formal firms. Because it's very hard to pay somebody's wages if there's no contract that specifies how much the person makes. So yes, it is a tragedy from a humanitarian point of view. The government cannot go and help every firm that is informal. But Laura's right, from a productivity point of view, the entrepreneurial capital we really want to save is the formal entrepreneurial capital. And that's exactly what government should be doing. Finally, very briefly, on Guillermo's point, he's absolutely right. You cannot have the money without the control. Let me put it this way. The G20 EPG, the Eminence Persons Group, I'm embarrassed to say that because it's such an embarrassing title, issued a report. I was one of the authors a couple of years ago. And we argued precisely that we need a bigger international financial safety net where different institutions provide liquidity, but where the role of conditionality remains in the hands of the IMF. And I think that's the right way to think about it. I cannot imagine an SPV which suddenly has its own conditionality I would feel perfectly okay if the SPV does the lending, but the other lenders, to some extent, at least on macro issues, subordinate their lending decisions to whether the IMF finds that the macro policy framework is okay or not. Some people may hate that for political reasons. I think that in the short run, there is no alternative. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Andres. And it's 1:15 now here in Washington. Perfectly understand if you want to disconnect, and I'm sure many have disconnected already. If not, just for those who are staying, one last question from my side. The way Andres put it was very clear. We have formal sector firms which we can support in some way or another, and then there is the rest, and there is some self-selection. In Latin America, one will say, well, many of those who can be supported, and especially many of those that can get the support, may not be necessarily the ones with the biggest organizational capital, maybe the ones that are more connected, and so on and so forth. And one can see every crisis as a great opportunity that should not be wasted for reform. So what, if anything, in these difficult times, can we leverage from this crisis to be in a better position for the future? What is that, by letting it go now, we may help the recovery later? Anyone who has a view on this?
I'd like to throw an idea, Martin.
Yes, Mauricio, please.
So we haven't talked too much, apart from the comment made by Laura, about informality. Informality has been the greatest enemy during the pandemic, because by definition, informality requires human contact. And the fact that so many jobs in Latin America are informal means that a lot of people during the lockdown have had no revenue because they're not supported by the payrolls, because maybe they are not below the poverty line, so they're not getting any cash transfers. So the informal economy is suffering the most. A good example is the hairdresser. Here in Colombia, 400,000 people work in that activity, 99% without a salary. And they're not getting any cash transfer from the government because they're not below the poverty line, or most of them. So here we have a real issue, which is making difficult the management of the lockdowns, the measures related to health. But thinking about the reform into the future, in this world in which the budgetary constraint has been relaxed somewhat, we should start thinking about very smart interventions that have to do not just with cutting payroll costs and all of that, which we already know as an economist, but now that we're subsidizing payrolls, that governments are actually paying the salaries or part of the salaries, this could be a tremendous opportunity to bring into formality some of these informal jobs. If we're going to subsidize payrolls, well, let's subsidize also payrolls, quote unquote, in the informal economy that formalize. Because I think with that, we will be tackling one of the crucial issues in Latin America, which has been pervasive, has many dimensions on inequality. We haven't talked about inequality today, on efficiency as well. So I will put a lot of focus on that issue in the reform agenda.
Thank you, Mauricio. Anyone else who wants to come in? I'm not sure whether Minister Briones is still connected. Any reaction on whether, if you are, you found insights that are useful in this discussion?
Thank you, Martin. I'm still connected. Yes, a lot of insights, very useful, and I think all of you mentioned this point. One of the main challenges, if we look or we think in having an opportunity in all this disaster, is how to formalize in the several areas, because informal people, either in the business sector or in the labor market, is a person in which we have a lot of problems to reach him and to know his salary, his revenues, and to react in this kind of crisis. So, needless to say, this is one of the structural problems we are facing. Even in Chile, we are seeing that this is a major problem. We are able to reach formal companies with state loan guaranteed credits, while we are not in a position to reach the kiosco, as Andres mentioned, or the haircut entrepreneur, as Mauricio was indicating. So this is a major problem, and I think it's a problem that will expand and increase in the forthcoming months. And I think we have to imagine and to think in the innovative ways to deal with. And actually, I think the only tool we have is just like to provide some base income for these people. And unfortunately, many countries in Latin America even they did not even have a good social register of their population. And again, this is a problem to reach these people, who are the ones that require the financial help. And we need a bridge to be built in order to reach them in a good fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio. Anyone else who wants to say one last word before I wrap up? So let me assume that the silence is not because you forgot to unmute. Let me say that this has been a very rich discussion. I found very informative. I have, for me, like 4 big takeaways, which I see as very important, going from the big picture, the need for this institutional design, the solutions that Mauricio, Andres proposed, that Guillermo commented on, this mixture of a special purpose vehicle with the involvement of international financial institutions as implementers, as a way to avoid the moral hazard that could come with it. I think that's clearly an important idea to push forward. I think I also take as a second point, very important, especially from Guillermo Calvo's intervention, the importance of protecting payment systems and the situation in which the private sector will be. The sudden stop, not to take for granted that those who have access to finance today will have access to finance tomorrow, and the kind of measures domestically that may make things much worse and push us back to hyperinflation and to domains that we have not seen in the past. Domestically, third point, given that for now, while we don't have these resources, we are seriously constrained, and unlike advanced economies, we can only do whatever we can, as Mauricio says, and not whatever it takes. What are the choices? Ways that we should be prioritizing the entrepreneurial capacity, the formal sector, the informal sector, those in need. Of course, we can gain some time, but sooner or later, there is a need for big decisions. We come from a period of social unrest and a lot of discontent in Latin America. The transparency, the consensus of the mechanisms through which we reach those decisions will be very important for the legitimacy of what comes forward. And finally, the opportunities for reform. Never waste a good crisis, and this is a huge crisis, as Andres reminded us. There are opportunities that come from formalization. Several of you pointed it out. If the nature of work is going to change, and we will have the need to operate much more electronically, this is also a great opportunity to formalize many things. But it is also a great opportunity to let go of things. In a way, this is like a big public expenditure review, to use the jargon of the World Bank, in which we are so constrained that we better go through everything we are financing and have a second and careful look at all of it. Again, this has been very rich. Many thanks again, Ignacio, for being with us and for being for the entire length of the discussion. Feel privileged to have such a panel of great economists and friends. Thank you all. Bye. Have a good day and stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.